Welcome to YogiViews, where my guest is yoga itself, through interviewing those who practice it, teach it, sell it, or simply love it. I am Antonio Sausys. For some, yoga is therapy, and they mean that in a symbolic way. For others, it actually is a form of therapy. It's widely known that yoga can enhance your physical and emotional well-being, but when yoga is practiced with a therapeutic intention in the form of yoga therapy, it can help prevent and aid recovery from physical and mental ailments. In recent years, and as more clinicians use yoga techniques either for themselves or for their patients, and as more teachers design specific applications of the teachings of yoga to address certain conditions, the spectrum of yoga therapy grows exponentially. What is yoga therapy and who is a yoga therapist is a matter of increasing interest and concern in the yoga and medical communities. My guest today is a board-certified internist, the medical editor of Yoga Journal, and the author of 2 books, Yoga as Medicine, The Yogic Prescription for Health and Healing, and Examining Your Doctor, a patient's guide to avoiding harmful medical care. His name is Timothy McCall. Welcome, Timothy.
Thank you very much. My pleasure to be here.
He has studied yoga since 1995 with Patricia Walden, and more recently, he has been working with Donald Moyer and Stryker. In addition, Timothy travels regularly to India to research yoga, yoga therapy, and Ayurveda, and to study with a traditional Ayurvedic Vaidhya doctor in Kerala and Tantric master in Bangalore. His main focus since the year 2000 has been investigating the therapeutic aspects of yoga, as well as the scientific explanations of yoga's effects. His articles have appeared in dozens of publications. He currently lives in the San Francisco Bay Area and gives lectures, seminars, and yoga workshops around the US and internationally. Timothy, my first question to you is, how did your personal yoga experience, your experience of yoga, how did it start for you?
Well, you know, I'm going to give you a different answer to that than I would have several years ago. I thought for years that I had started yoga in 1995, pretty much through chance, if you believe in chance, wound up in the studio of Patricia Walden in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But actually, I realized recently that my yoga journey started about 20 years before that. I was 18 years old, and a book changed my life. I was a competitive tennis player, tournament tennis player, college tennis player, and I got turned on to a book called The Inner Game of Tennis. And it didn't just revolutionize my tennis game, it revolutionized the whole way I looked at the world, and the whole way I taught myself physical skills. So I decided a couple of years ago to go back and buy a used copy of it, read it again, and I was floored. It was a yoga book through and through. It was about repatterning the nervous system, using the breath to calm down, studying your mind, all these things that we know of as yoga technology. And indeed, the book was dedicated to Guhu Maharaji. So it was written by a yoga practitioner. He never used the word yoga, as far as I know, once in the whole book. But it was really the philosophy of yoga. So for the first 20 years, tennis was my asana. Tennis was the bodily thing that I used, self-study, control of the breath, nervous system, repatterning samskars, all these things, but with tennis instead of asana.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And the particular interest in yoga therapy, or the mix, because you're a doctor, and so
right.
How did that happen?
Well, of course I have the background in medicine, and I have a curiosity about science. And I started doing yoga, and as I did yoga, I started to hear all these stories. Oh, you know, I used to have back pain, but now that I do yoga, I don't have back pain anymore. Or people would say, oh, you know, these poses are really useful when you have menstrual cramps, or do that if you have a sinus problem. And I started hearing all these things, and I thought, well, you know, maybe I'm going to investigate this. So I started to try to find out what scientific research had been done. Turned out not much at that time, although I was able to get my hands on some. And so I just decided that I was going to see what I could find out. And I just started on a path of trying to investigate, trying to see what had been done, talking to people in the field who had a little bit more of a scientific orientation. So early on, someone recommended I call Roger Cole. And Roger Cole is a scientist and yoga teacher, well-known yoga teacher. And Roger was very gracious and spent a long time on the phone with me, and we had a discussion about the nervous system and several things. And, you know, all these years later, I'm still on that path.
I'm quite convinced, I would say. We'll go back to the research aspect because I have a couple of specific questions about that. But yoga therapy is a relatively new aspect of yoga, or at least as we know it now. In fact, maybe you can say that it was there before as yoga chikitsa or maybe as Ayurveda. But in this moment, there is not really a one valid definition or a definition of yoga therapy that is accepted by everybody in the same way. What is your, or the one that you are closer to as a definition of yoga therapy?
To me, yoga therapy is simply using the various tools in the yoga toolbox, which includes asana and breathing techniques and meditation and chanting and service and philosophical ideas, using all or any of these things to try to somehow improve health and well-being or to try to help relieve a medical or a health condition.
Mm-hmm. Well, some say that yoga therapy is not necessary because Ayurveda was already there. And Ayurveda deals with health issues. And what is your opinion about this?
Well, you know, there may have been a time when they were very integrated, and there may be some places where they're very integrated. But I think that, you know, a lot of the Ayurveda that we see, particularly in the modern world, is not particularly spiritual. In fact, I was just looking at just happened to be reading the Ashtanga Hridaya today, which is one of the classic Ayurvedic texts. And they talk about the 3 goals of life, not the four goals of life, the 3. They leave off moksha. They leave off liberation. Mm-hmm. They talk about success in the world, pleasure, and duty. You know, dharma, kama, artha, but moksha they don't talk about.
The liberation, the final state that yoga talks
Now,
about.
the other thing that I have seen is that many people in the Ayurvedic world are not terribly knowledgeable about yoga practices. Mm-hmm. So, you know, yes, you can use Ayurveda and yoga together, but we have to have people who are competent in both. Now, my master who I study with in India, he understands yoga, he understands Ayurveda, he's also trained in Siddha, he's also a master of Kalari, which is the indigenous martial art of Kerala. So he brings all those forms of mastery, and so can take marma from the Kalari, and he knows about breath techniques, and I was showing him some breathing techniques. I was looking, and he said, oh, no, you don't do that one. And so he was correcting something that another teacher had given me, saying, for me and my particular balance of doshas, etc., he was thinking that this particular breath technique was not good. But, you know, I think what we're probably realistically going to see is yoga teachers getting more up to speed on Ayurveda. You know, I think probably simultaneously we're also going to see Ayurveda people getting more up to speed in yoga. So there will be an integration. You know, David Frawley made a really interesting point about this. He was saying that through a fluke of history, yoga came to America in the late 1800s. Mm-hmm. Ayurveda came in around 1970. So these two things, which, you know, there wouldn't have been people in India doing yoga who wouldn't have had a basic understanding of Ayurveda. But for the last, you know, 40 years in the United States, the majority of yoga practitioners did not have any kind of sophisticated understanding of even the basics of Ayurveda. That's now changing in the last several years as Ayurveda is now also growing. Mm-hmm. But so, you know, I mean, I think we're splitting hairs here in a sense.
Yeah.
I think the bottom line is that Ayurveda is the indigenous holistic health system of India. It's a very powerful system of medicine. It's completely compatible with yoga. It can inform yoga and it can make yoga better. Because when you understand someone's constitution, when you understand their particular imbalances, when you understand if their digestive fire is off or whatever the different aspects you're going to look at, it helps you shape the yoga you give to someone. Even in a group class, you know that kapha student, you have to whip them into shape a little bit more because they're probably not going to give full effort. Whereas your pitta and vata students, you're going to have like, okay, now calm down, breathe, stop bugging out your eyes, whatever you're doing. So just even that basic knowledge can help you, even within a group class, start to personalize the approach to each student. Which is ultimately, by the way, what yoga therapy is about. Yoga therapy is about not one size fits all, not a standardized protocol for all people with the same condition, but rather a personalized approach which takes into consideration of all the factors that make this person uniquely who they are right now, which includes an understanding of Ayurveda, posture, nervous system, many factors.
I remember reading an article of yours about reductionism, right, and
yes.
and holistic approach as a different. It's a little bit of what you're saying now, right? In a way.
Well, I think there's a mistake that people make in analyzing healthcare. People say, "Oh, there's alternative medicine, there's conventional medicine." Okay, that is not a logically defensible distinction because some things get lumped into alternative that are holistic. Some things get lumped into conventional that are holistic. What really matters is it holistic or is it reductionist? Reductionist is taking complicated problems, focusing on one factor, and jumping on that. So if it's heart disease, we'd look at cholesterol, for example, and aggressively treat that with drugs and sometimes diet to try to use that one way, that reductionist method, to get at a whole universe of a situation of heart disease. Holism is saying, okay, let's look at their physical well-being. Let's look at their emotional well-being. Let's look at the state of their nervous system. Let's look at how happy they are in their work. Let's look at their life situation. Let's look at all these different factors. And we tend to try to intervene gently, often in several different ways simultaneously, with the idea of making the whole organism function better. I like to say that in holism, we treat any individual condition by trying to improve the overall condition of the individual.
Quite a difference with
it's a very different approach. And what happens is there's an awful lot of what we call alternative medicine that I call alternative reductionism. So if you're like some dear friends of mine taking 27 different dietary supplements, that's really not holism. That's reductionism. That's taking individual chemical compounds, even if they maybe are a vitamin, or even if they came from a natural source, super concentrated in a pill. That's different than taking a food, for example, which has tens of thousands of different chemical compounds, many of which have never been even categorized or characterized, and which work together in a synergistic way that we don't begin to understand. And that's holism. Food is holism. Herbs are holism. A drug or even a vitamin is reductionism.
And in a way, if I'm not wrong, this also relates to the way that our Western model is more oriented towards symptoms and addressing the symptoms, whereas the holistic approach tries to understand about the origin and who the person is and why the person...
in conventional medicine, they do try to get at the root cause when they can. And part of the reason why conventional medicine is so successful in dealing with infections is that they do get at least a root cause, the pathological organism that's causing the problem. But the problem is that for most problems, you can't find a causative factor. What's the causative factor for, type 2 diabetes or arthritis? We don't really know. Now, when you view it from a holistic perspective, so for example, from the perspective of Ayurveda, we can say, well, we may not know everything that's happening biochemically, but we can say, boy, their vata is really out of whack. And so they're imbalanced, which in Ayurveda is viewed as a root cause. You treat that root cause, and many conditions, including that one, will tend to get better. So, yeah, and so on some level, you know, people who are working holistically may be getting deeper in. And the other thing is that from a reductionist viewpoint, and the viewpoint in modern medicine is things often are thought of as having a single cause. In holism, we say everything is multifactorial. I mean, even if you get hit by a bus, well, where were you? Why were you there? Were you paying attention? Were you stressed? Were you distracted? You know, everything, you know, two people can get the same virus. One can get sick, one doesn't get sick. So it's not just the virus that causes the problem. It's more complicated, always more complicated.
Yeah. It reminds me a few years ago when I met Dr. Ananda Balayogi Bhavanani, he's the son of Swami Gitananda Giri.
Yes.
And he wrote something very interesting about if we don't take all this integrated approach, or if we don't take the integration that all things are happening through or with that model into account, then we're falling in yogopathy. Rather than yoga therapy, it's like following the allopathic model, but with yoga, so it's yogopathy. And I like that comment.
You know, there is an effort right now to shove the round peg of yoga into the square hole of modern medicine. And I think, for example, what I mentioned earlier, this idea that, you know, here are the 12 poses that have been clinically proven to be effective for back pain. Okay, now from a yoga perspective, okay, fine, you're doing it to get the study. But that's not the best yoga therapy, because a good yoga teacher will know right off the bat that some of those poses aren't appropriate for some people with back pain. You know, or even, you know, Judith Lassiter has a wonderful quotation. She says, it doesn't matter if a pose is supposed to be good for you, it only matters whether it is. And a good yoga teacher, by using their observational skills, can tell. They can notice, how does your posture look? How does your breathing? What's the color of your face? Are your eyes glazing over? What are you reporting back to me? Based on all these factors, I can tell in real time, is this likely to help you, or is this likely not to help you? And you know, so from a yoga perspective, it doesn't really matter if a randomized controlled study found that 95% of people benefit from Trikonasana for lower back pain. If this person with back pain, you put them in Trikonasana, they go, oh, you know, it's not going to help them. At least not that particular version of Trikonasana. Maybe somehow modified it might. But so, I mean, I think it's great that we do research. The research helps us make the case for yoga. But let's not pretend that any of the research that's being done captures what yoga can do. Not fully. It only gives us a glimpse of the possibility, and it's almost always better than what the research will show.
And you've been exposed to research here and in India.
Yeah.
Is it different? Is it the same?
It's become much more similar. You know, in the old days, there was a rap against Indian research as being methodologically problematic. No control groups and all that kind of stuff. Fact is, they're putting a lot of money into yoga research in India right now. And some of the best research in the world is now coming out of India, and it's methodologically very sophisticated. And actually, because labor costs are so much cheaper there, they can often do larger studies, more patients, which means they have more statistical power. They can do longer studies, so instead of following people for 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks, they follow people for a year. You know, so we tend not to see that in American studies. So if anything, I think you could argue that Indian studies are by and large better than American studies, just because they're bigger, they're longer, there are more control groups. You know, I don't want to denigrate American research, because certainly there's a lot of it, and it too is becoming better in quality. I mean, overall, there's more quality. You know, International Association of Yoga Therapy, their journal, the International Journal of Yoga Therapy, is now peer-reviewed, indexed in Medline. You know, these are real accomplishments, and that's a real step forward for the field that's happening in terms of giving it legitimacy in the world of conventional science.
And which is perhaps one of the reasons why research is emphasized and so important, right?
Right. I think it's a matter of making the case for why yoga works. I think by and large, research is not going to shape what we do. I mean, researchers think they're going to study something, and they're going to tell us, oh no, stop doing that, do this instead. There may be some instances where that will happen. So for example, there have been some studies that have found that yoga does not give, even vigorous yoga does not give the strong aerobic workout of, say, running or swimming. Okay, so we know that, if you want to get a vigorous aerobic workout, you probably need to do something outside your yoga class. Yoga is probably not the best or most efficient way to do that. You might actually concentrate on trying to make your yoga practice a little more meditative and then go for a run on the side.
Now, also, if we relate to the scope of yoga, or one of the main teachings that says that we are mind, body, and spirit,
right.
It seems feasible to research things that happen in the body. It seems feasible to understand how the mind can work through research, but how do you research the spirit?
Well, it's problematic, and as I wrote in an article years ago, we don't have a spirituogram, so
Exactly.
we can't measure it. But I think we can ask people to report things, how compassionate they are, how forgiving they are, how much sense of meaning they have in their life. There are ways you might be able to get at, questioning people indirectly, not measuring, per se. That's probably not going to be happening. But of course, the other thing is, because the mind and body and spirit are connected, or really just all part of one thing that's interconnected, when you improve spiritual health, physical health, bodily health, mental health improves. So fine, keep your measurements mostly on the body and on the mind, but as a yoga therapist or as a yoga teacher, we can say that if we can help someone be calmer, come to peace with their life, find a sense of meaning and purpose in their life, feel more compassionate toward other people, feel more compassionate, loving toward themselves, that all these things are likely to have profound effects on their health as well.
Now that we are on the topic of mind, body, and spirit, and because perhaps a lot of people either know yoga as the discipline they go and practice 2-3 times a week, and they have no connection with how yoga can really help with a condition. What would you say, or what is the way yoga helps the body and the mind and the spirit? And let's start with the body. How does yoga help the body?
Well, first of all,
in terms of therapy,
we're going to divide this up for the point of conversation, but helping the body, mind, and spirit is often happening simultaneously and is interconnected. But we'll divide it up. From a purely physical standpoint, or primarily physical standpoint, posture is an obvious one. People often in the modern world are slumping, shoulders forward, head forward, biomechanically a disaster, and leads to all kinds of problems: fatigue, poor breathing, stress. Many things are related to posture. So improving posture is a huge one. We know that yoga increases flexibility. We know it builds muscle strength. We know it helps with physical balance, being able to not fall over when you're at risk of falling, for example. So yoga can help the functioning of many organs and many organ systems in the body. So the cardiovascular system, the respiratory system, the immune system. Various studies have shown improvements in all these areas. And really pretty much all the systems of the body seem to function more optimally. A key to yoga's physical effects, and it's of course related to the psychological health as well, is the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system. So we all know, or most of us know, about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. These two, the fight or flight response and the rest and digest system, are in a balance in the body. In most people in the modern world, they're out of balance. Typically, there's way too much fight or flight, too much stress, but actually too much parasympathetic is also a problem. So chronic fatigue syndrome, postpartum depression, other problems can be related to not enough juice, not enough fight or flight. So, and people say, oh, well, yoga is really relaxing. It stimulates the parasympathetic nervous system. But if you actually go and do particularly vigorous yoga classes that are focused on sun salutations and Kapalabhati breathing and handstands and full back bends, every one of those practices I just named stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight system. So what we're really doing in yoga is alternatively stimulating either parasympathetic or sympathetic, causing these two systems to each work optimally so that they can be on when we need them on, and they can back off when we don't need them. Problem for a lot of people in the modern world with stress is their flight or flight system comes on with the emergency and it doesn't shut off, or they keep on thinking about the problem and they kick their nervous system stress response right back on. And so a lot of the stress-related disease comes from just too much or too frequent activation of the fight or flight system.
Mm-hmm. And that's in regards to the body. What about the mind? How can yoga help the mind of an individual?
Well, first of all, the mind is intimately connected to the nervous system. So people who have too much sympathetic tone tend to be anxious, they tend to sleep poorly, they tend to be nervous, worry a lot, so anxiety, and that is a huge problem in the modern world. And of course, depression can be the far end of anxiety. So you are super stressed for long enough, it can lead to depression. There's been a lot of very interesting research lately showing that the stress hormone cortisol is related to depression, specifically the more agitated or rajasic depression, where people can't sleep and they're nervous. And it seems that when stress is supposed to feel bad. You're supposed to feel crummy when you're stressed. It's part of the feedback your body gives you to change the situation. Keep on feeling crummier and crummier and crummier, stress hormones higher and higher. At some point it tips over into depression. Now there's another kind of depression which is a more lethargic or tamasic depression. That tends to be more the too much parasympathetic thing. So this state of the nervous system is directly tied to the mind. Simply quieting the mind, which we do when we breathe slowly and deeply, that sense of really resting, that sense of finding peace, of noticing that when you quiet everything down, there's kind of a little sense of joy that wells up from inside. It's the experience of pretty much everybody who does yoga seriously. Mm-hmm. Even people who just try it for the first time may get it. That can be a profound realization that on some level all this craziness in the mind is something that's on top of a kind of quieter, calmer, more peaceful, joyful thing that's more toward our core.
This concludes the first part of a two-part show where I'm interviewing Timothy McCall. Well, thank you very much. Thanks very much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Yes.
And thank you for your contribution to this effort as well.
Thank you. And I hope to have you again in the show sometime.
That'd be wonderful.
Thank you. My guest today was Timothy McCall. He is a board-certified internist, the medical editor of Yoga Journal, and the author of 2 books, Yoga as Medicine, the Yogic Prescription for Health and Healing, and Examining Your Doctor, a Patient's Guide to Avoiding Harmful Medical Care. He has studied yoga since 1995 with Patricia Walden, and more recently he has been working with Donald Moyer and Stryker. In addition, Timothy travels regularly to India to research yoga, yoga therapy and Ayurveda, and to study with a traditional Ayurvedic Vaidhya, or doctor, in Kerala, and a Tantric master in Bangalore. His main focus since the year 2000 has been investigating the therapeutic aspects of yoga, as well as the scientific explanations of yoga's effects. His articles have appeared in dozens of publications. He currently lives in San Francisco, in the Bay Area, and gives lectures, seminars, and yoga workshops around the US and internationally. I hope you liked our show today, and if you care to let me know, shoot me an email at antonio@yogiviews.com, and I hope to see you the next time.